All right. We'll begin with, Tate, thank you so much for the introduction. Thank you for beginning with the Toni Morrison quote. As you know, that's one of my favorite. But I'll begin with an Audre Lorde quote. Raising Black children, female and male, in the mouth of a racist, sexist, suicidal dragon is perilous and chancy. If they cannot love and resist at the same time, they will probably not survive. And in order to survive, they must let go. This is what mothers teach: love, survival, that is self-definition and letting go. And so today in my presentation, Black Interruptions toward a genre of Black mothers in mourning, I'll bridge survival, right, with resistance in order to understand something about the ways that Black mothers are brought forth into the public square, into the public discourse in ways that impacts how we talk about state-sanctioned violence and how we talk about how we defend, right, the dead, if I can borrow a quote from the Black feminist thinker, Christina Sharpe. What does it mean to defend the dead, she asked. In recent years, Black mothers have been called forth into the public stage to bear witness to the ways that white racial violence and domestic terrorism snuffs out Black life, right? We're seeing the resurgence of this actually in real time with the recent debates going on about people profiting from Black grief. From popular culture, right, such as films as The Wire, to First 48, to political campaigns, Hillary Clinton's campaign, who brought forth the mothers, that she called the mothers of the movement. The heightened focus on Black mothers of the movement has raised this visibility and profiles of Black mothers in ways that it has not always been visible. These are mothers and figures who are not only sort of grieving their deaths, right, of their childs, but these are mothers who are asked to use their grief, right, to illuminate, right, a sort of healing process for the rest, or activate a healing process for the rest of the nation. And so these mothers' grief, I argue, function as a sort of rhetorical campaign, and I'll sort of march you through what I mean by that, and how they not only have to grieve in public oftentimes in the cases of high profile deaths, but ways that they must defend their childs, their daughters, their sons, and in this way, I argue they adopt a public persona that allows them to speak about premature death at the hands of white racist police and white vigilantes. As such, we have what I call a genre, right, of mothers who are called to make a scene, as Henry Washington Jr. has recently argued in his essay on Black mothers. Tate, if you can go to the next slide. And so what I'll do first, in order to sort of understand something about the rhetorical and the political significance of Black mothers, I'll kind of walk us through a sort of theorization of how we have understood Black mothers and Black motherhood in particular. Claudia Rankine writes shortly. Claudia Rankine is a poet at Yale University. And Claudia Rankine, she wrote the book Citizen. Claudia Rankine writes shortly after the death of the Charleston Nine at the Emmanuel Baptist AME Church. She writes that the condition of Black life is one of mourning, and that Black mothers are always sort of prepared for this inevitable death of their child and of their sons in particular, in ways that she's talking about, but inevitable death. And so they have to, in so many ways, have the talk, right? As soon as the child is born, right? We oftentimes, especially if you grew up or socialized in Black spaces with Black parents or Black mother figures, you were given the talk. And the talk symbolized several things. So one, it was about a cautionary tale about how to behave in the face of white people, right? So that might have sounded like, put your hands on the driver's wheel, right? If you're pulled over, don't go too fast, turn down your music if the cop pulls you over, don't talk too loud, don't raise your voice, don't make sudden movements, right? And so the talk has always been this sort of cautionary tales about what the scholar Ursula Orr has called the deep rules of democracy. And these are oftentimes very unwritten or racialized rules that teaches Black folk in particular how to behave in the face of white people and whiteness in general. Secondly, Black mothers in particular has functioned as what Horton Spillers, Saidiya Hartman, Christina Sharpe, all Black feminist thinkers and performance scholars have called fungible commodities. And what I mean about fungible commodities, meaning Black women, if we look at the sort of the larger trajectory, whether we're looking at feminist scholarship or sociological scholarship, Black women has functioned as these sort of fungible commodities, which essentially means they can be exchanged for whatever value people want them to be. If we think of periods of enslavement, when Black mothers were only thought to be producers of children for the plantation, they could be sexually violated at the whims of the master or at the whims of any man for that matter who saw fit to use their bodies. And so their bodies in certain ways was a vessel for reproduction and a site of violence that could be abused at any moment. And so there was never thought at any point in time where Black women in a large scale had any sort of agency over their identity, over their bodies, and over their personhood. And third, if we move on to what I'm calling a sort of failed motherhood, if we trace white feminist scholarship, one thing that becomes sort of apparently clear, in particular, I'm looking at the work of Ruth Feldman. And Ruth Feldman writes about the ways that Black mothers are oftentimes thought to be outside of the frame of motherhood. One common notion of ways in which she is thought to be outside of motherhood is not only because, right, we oftentimes have, right, given this sort of notion of this fungible commodity, but we also have a notion of Black mothers that typically is prescribed to women who are respectable, women who are married or heterosexual, women who have children, and women who are silent. Right? And so in that ways, Black women, in the ways that they use their rhetorical agency to speak out, oftentimes thought to be too loud, too boisterous, too much, to take up too much space, right? That directly clashes with white feminist particular scholarship about Black women not having access to these privileges of American democracy, right? Being some of the last group of people to have access to the vote outside of white women. And so in that way, I'm calling this a sort of failed motherhood. Think in particular also about the ways that we've heard, right, Black women be called bad mothers for their child's actions, right? In the event oftentimes of these highly publicized deaths, right, we often hear references to the fact that they're single mothers, right? Or they're young teenage mothers, right? Or there was some error, there was some tragic, fatal flaw in their parenting that inherently made them or put them sort of outside of this scope or this genre of mothers, as I would call it. And then finally, right, Black women in the event of this premature death of their child, they're often called to be what Erica Lawson has called a public mother, or public motherhood. And then in this way, sort of going back to sort of my initial comments at the beginning, right? This public motherhood that uses Black women's grief, uses their pain, that uses their mourning to sort of galvanize an audience, to galvanize a community, a communal presence that uses grief as an affect, right? As a way for sort of political participation. And this is significant, right? Because oftentimes we don't, right, when we think about Black folk and political participation, right, with the exception of, we have a few names that recently resurfaced, like Fannie Lou Hamer, Ella Baker, right, with Kamala Harris now being the vice president, Shirley Chisholm, and a few others, we oftentimes don't ascribe Black women to sort of political agency or having any type of political presence. And so, only I'm arguing then that in the events of these deaths is only times when you see, or one of the few times is when you see Black women called forth to sort of be political activists or be some sort of representative. For example, we have Sabrina Fulton, the mother of Trayvon Martin, who recently ran for office. You have the mother of Jordan Davis, who elected to office in Florida, right? You have these mothers who are also running actively for political offices to influence and exact change. The mother of Michael Brown, Leslie Next Baden, who also is using her voice not only right to speak to the ways that which whiteness sort of cuts, right, or interrupts, right, Black life, but also to use their voice in political spaces to exact and effect policy changes. And so I think this is under some of the common tropes or the understandings that we have of Black motherhood as it relates to state-sanctioned death. If we can move to the next slide, theorizing Black vulnerability. So in recent research by Professor Tommy Curry, who is a philosopher, he has recently theorized a book called The Man Not, in which he's theorizing this concept of Black vulnerability. And I'll briefly touch on how I deviate sort of from Curry in these ways. And so while Curry theorizes sort of Black boyhood and Black men as sort of inherently representing this threat to the American democracy, this threat to the political system, the social structure, right? There are other ways in which he argues that in that way that Black men and Black boys possess no ontological resistance to the thought of others. So simply he means that Black boys and Black men are whatever people say they are, right? They're thuggish, right? They're rapists, they're latent rapists, right? They're misogynists, they're patriarchal, right? All these sort of tropes that Black men have been called, right? There is no ontological resistance to that. So they become vulnerable as a result to these systems of power that would always deem them as sort of these monsters. Let's think about all of these sort of cases, or recent cases, right? Darren Wilson called Michael Brown a monster, right? He said it was like holding on to Hulk Hogan, right? Think about this, you're calling an 18-year-old Black boy, right, Hulk Hogan, or Trayvon Martin, right, a teenager, right, who was also called, right, a monster, right? He was feared. George Zimmerman feared for his life from a Black boy who was under 170 pounds, right? So these sort of tropes, or white women, right? If we think about shortly after Reconstruction or during the enslavement period, when Black men at record highs were being lynched because of at the accusation, right? Not even the evidence, right? But at the slightest accusation that white women said they were sexually assaulted by them, or molested, or even looked at, right? If we can go to the case of Emmett Till, and we'll also sort of work our way to Emmett Till's case. And so that is what he means by no sort of ontological resistance. You are whatever people say you are. And so Calvin Warren, philosopher at Emory University, Calvin Warren says, right, it's this sort of dichotomy between the penis and the phallus, where this penis sort of represents this sort of threat to whiteness in ways that sort of circumscribes or colors or tailored textures sort of Black men and Black boys experience in the United States. But if we then, right, and then these are ways that I sort of deviate or add on to what Curry is talking about. But if we sort of extend this vulnerability, right, sort of trope, or this theorization of vulnerability to Black girls and Black women, right, oftentimes, right, we have a notion, right, that Black girls, if we look in the school system, are unruly, right, they're loud, they're sexually available, they're disrespectable, and they're a disruption to the system. They're a disruption to learning. Oftentimes, right, we see sort of record highs of Black girls and Black women being kicked out of schools, just being thought to be too much, of being available, right, based off of what they wear in the public, that anybody, you have the right as such to be sexually violated by anybody because of what you wear. And so if we relate this again back to slavery, right, or Jim Crow, right, when we were seeing record highs, oftentimes, of Black women being molested or sexually assaulted by white men, and there was nothing that would ever be done about that. Oftentimes, this was in cahoots with the police, or officials who were in charge of protecting us, right? So if there was, a thought of a crime, or the husband or the partner did something, right, and they found the wife first, she could be violated without any sort of repercussions happening. And then further, if we move from not only Black boys and men and Black girls and women to sort of think about the ways that Black trans and genderqueer folk are often thought to be sort of abject, right? To have this sort of false identity or to be feigning a sort of identity in which they're not, right? And so that makes sort of Black trans women and Black genderqueer folk as sort of precarious, as being vulnerable to these same systems that targets and kills Black men, the same system that targets Black girls and women as being unruly, and then the same system as such that affects the Black trans and genderqueer community. And so I extend this sort of argument of vulnerability to not only think about death, right, but to think about the ways that we use our voices in the face of this vulnerability to sort of fight back against this, this notion, this definition, and this prescription. And if we can move to the next slide, then sort of given this sort of understanding then that we have of Black motherhood and Black vulnerability, then I asked in my research and in this presentation, I asked, what can Black motherhood be in the wake, in the afterlives, or what Christina Sharpe calls in the afterlives of slavery? And I'll briefly read a quote about what she means by the wake. Wakes are processes, she writes. Through them, we think about the dead and about our relations to them. They are rituals through which to enact grief and memory. Wakes allow those among the living to mourn the passing of the dead through ritual. They are the watching of relatives and friends beside the body of the deceased from death to burial, and the accompanying drinking, feasting, and other observances, a watching practiced as a religious observance. Finally, wake means being awake, also consciousness, right? And so what I mean by the afterlives of slavery, right, is this concept of Blackness or Black objection that sort of follows from the afterlives of slavery. So recent scholarship, particularly, and some of you may be familiar with some of this work in what they're calling Afro-pessimism, that makes the sort of larger argument that slavery is not over, right? We have simply extended slavery and it has sort of transformed. And so the world in which we live and participate is inherently anti-Black. And so there's no hope in any political project, whether it's a multicultural project, whether it's a Black political project. There's no hope in the American Democratic Project given these sort of afterlives of slavery and the ways that it manifests in our public life. And so moving from that question, then I asked, then how can Black motherhood serve as an interruption? And if we go to the definition, interruption has multiple meanings. One, it means an act of course, of interrupting something or someone, or the state of being interrupted, such as a stoppage or a hindering of an activity for a time, a break in the continuity of something, right? And so I not only try to use this concept of interruption to think about the ways that white supremacy sort of interrupts Black life, or is sort of always there, it cuts it, it stops it prematurely, right? But also tries to think about Black rhetorical agency and Black agency and how Black mothers sort of interrupt these narratives about their child in death, right? Because oftentimes we see these campaigns, these rhetorical campaigns by Black women and Black family members to sort of talk about the dignity of their child, talk about the true character, right? You saw this particularly in recent memory, right after the death of Trayvon Martin, right? You saw Sabrina Fulton sort of throughout the national media continually talk about what a gentle soul he was, how much he loved friends, how much he loved family. Similarly, we saw that with Leslie McSpaden and many others, also with, and we can't forget Breonna Taylor. Oftentimes we forgot to sort of talk about Breonna Taylor and her mother. And her mother has sort of been very vocal recently about the ways that Black women have been sort of, Black daughters have been sort of excluded from this discourse about Black death or Black premature death. So I try to think of interruption as a way to sort of stop, to counteract these sort of dominant prescriptions of Black life as always inherently criminal and violent, and thus deserving of these sort of deaths. So the theoretical sort of framework that I'm using comes from social movement theory from two scholars, Robert Scott, and John Smith in 1969. They write this article called The Rhetoric of Confrontation, And so I'm arguing in ways that this is what sort of these mothers of the movement, as I'm calling, or as they have been called, this rhetoric of confrontation is what I think they're using to help sort of theorize this concept of interruption. So they argue that confrontation is a totalistic strategy, adopting biblical language, right? They write, the last shall be first, right? And they assert that this strategy is a can't lose strategy, since there is nowhere, right? When you're last, there's nowhere to go but up. So having suffered being down so long, you deserve, right? Black people in this instance deserve to move up. And so they argue that this totalistic strategy is a language of riot and protest. And in this instance, I'm arguing that it's a language of Black women and Black mothers' protest. So the first tenet of that language of confrontation is the thesis that, one, we are already dead in the world as it is. We do not count. We are not persons, right? So going back to sort of my argument about from Afro-pessimism and Black studies scholarship that talks about social death, right? Black people already being thought to be less than human, of not having civic access to the vote, not having access to structural resources, not having access to power, not having access to capital, not having literal access to manhood or womanhood or motherhood, if we want to be particular in these instances. So we are not persons, we are already dead, right? The second tenet then is that we can be reborn. We have nothing to hang on to. There's no old identity to stop us from identifying with the new world. No matter how horrifying this prospect may seem in the outset, a new world will certainly be reborn of the fire that we shall create. And I'll think about this, this sort of rebirth, sort of as you see it sort of mobilized by these Black mothers. You hear in the aftermath, you hear a lot of, or a number of these Black mothers saying that, you know, we have a new identity. We are former mothers now, but we are still mothers. We are still mothering our sons and our daughters, even in death, right? So there is nothing is going to stop us. This, by virtue of being a former mother, that's not going to stop us. We are still parenting, and we're teaching other Black boys and other Black daughters, right, how to still live, right? How to avoid, right, these sort of trappings of white racist capitalist supremacy, how to avoid those. And so they take on this new persona, this new identity. Third, we have the stomach for the fight. You don't. Having degraded humanity, you are overwhelmed by this guilt. And I think particular, and we're gonna move right on to her, I think in particular of Mamie Till, right? Shortly in the aftermath of Emmett Till's death, Mamie Till says, I don't have a moment to hate. I'll pursue justice for the rest of my life. She sees his body and she says, I can't not show this, as much as this makes me squeamish, as much as this makes me cringe. I can do this. I have to use my son's body as a sort of rhetorical device to let the world see, she says, let the world see what I have seen, what I have experienced. And I will continue this fight as long as I have breath in my body, she says. So she has the stomach for the fight. Finally, we are united and we understand, right? We are united in a sense of a past dead and a present that is valuable only to turn into a future that is free of your degrading domination. Again, and you'll see with Mothers of the Movement, also if we want to track further with the mothers of in Venezuela in the 70s and the 80s who were protesting the regime, the political regime at the time. They organized around being former mothers, or what they call mothers of disappeared children, right? We see with Mothers of the Movement, a lot of them have sort of galvanized around that sort of shared identity. Felicia Stewart, who also is a rhetoric and communication scholar at Morehouse College, Felicia Stewart has an article that talks about these letters that Sabrina Fulton wrote to Michael Brown's mom, to Jordan Davis's mom, right, to Oscar Grant's mom, to Eric Garner's mother, right? And so she uses her sort of positionality, right, as a former mother, right, to talk about, to connect, right, as a bridge. So she's using her grief as a bridge to connect to these other women in order to draw strength So we are united in a sense of a past dead and a present. So using that then as my framework, I want to move to my next slide, in which we look at Mamie Till's sort of rhetorical campaign. And I'm borrowing this language from, and I know I'm dropping a lot of names, but I like to make sure I use my citations and give people credit. I'm drawing my inspiration from Brandon Irby. Brandon Irby is a English scholar at the University of Kentucky. And Brandon Irby writes a dissertation called Mamie Till's Rhetorical Campaign. So one of the reasons that we even have, right, this language of Black mothers mourning, right, is largely in recent years, is largely because of Mamie Till. When her son, Emmett Till, was murdered in August of 1955 in Money, Mississippi, she was instructed to bury his body without opening the box by state officials, right? This was supposed to be a hush-hush sort of case, a case that did not draw much attention. It was open and closed, right? Literally the jury came back in less than an hour. And they later said that the only reason they took an hour because they didn't want to make it seem like it was a sham. But she talked about how she knew it was a sham from the beginning, and that J.W. Milam and Roy would not be convicted. But she said, I couldn't do that, right? I couldn't keep that box closed. I had to use him. I had to use his body as this sort of, as a way for everybody else to sort of gain sympathy and to sort of catalyze a movement around death. So when she, as Kevin DeLuca and Christine Harrell writes, that when Mamie Till sort of entered Chicago's AAA Rayner and Sons Funeral Home to identify his body, there was no way, they argued, that she could have imagined or been prepared for what she would see. And then because literally less than 2 weeks later, less than 2 weeks prior, she had just sent him there to Mississippi to visit with her uncle and his cousins. And she told him, and is quoted as saying, she said, "Do not hesitate to humble yourself, even if you have to get down on your knees," right? So she's giving him this civic education, right? Or going back to the talk, right? As I mentioned in the beginning, she's giving Emmett this talk about how to behave in the South, right? He's from Chicago. He doesn't know these sort of rules of Southern democracy. And so when it reached his mother, she was immediately sort of cast into the limelight, not because the media, not because of the press, but because of her voice, because of the way she mobilized and showed his body, his bloated body that was more than 5 times the original size, right? Face distorted. I'm sure most of us have seen that, and I chose not to re-show that. That image, we all have that image, etched sort of in our heads, and in many ways, if you can't unsee that. And the Smithsonian Museum in DC has the picture of it in the casket with the picture of his face on the casket. And so in so many ways, you can't unsee Emmett's face and what he looked like. And to think that not only that the mother had to look at that, but that she was letting the world see it. More than 600,000 people walked through Robert Temple, Church of God in Christ, to watch his body, to view his body. And that's just a rough sort of estimate. It probably was like in the million, far into the millions, especially then when we think about not only did she do that, right? But she allowed Jet magazine to publish that staging of him in death, to publish that image, which had a large readership. And so a lot of Black people, right, had sort of access to his story because of that. We see also his story works its way into Black iconography and literature. We see, I can't think of the name of that book. It's a coming of age story, Coming of Age in Mississippi, right? It serves as a warning tale. We see that in Carla Holloway's book called Passed On, African-American Mourning Stories, right? We see this in children's books that are warning kids of how to behave around white people and what could potentially happen to you if you didn't. And speaking of and referencing and going back to Carla Holloway's Passed On, she writes in her book, she says, "The story of Till's lynching lingered like melancholy in the memory of Black folk. The 20th century rehearsed nearly to perfection a relentless cycle of cultural memory and Black mourning. So from the moment that she decided to leave his body unretouched, right? She didn't want it dressed up. She didn't want them to fix it. She wanted the world to see what it looked like, in order to let the world see what white supremacy had done and could do. She became the driving catalyst to the politicization, right, of Till's death, of her son's death. So she helped to politicize her son's body in ways that Black bodies, or Black people in general, because I don't like saying Black bodies, the way that Black people in general are not oftentimes politicized. We're oftentimes thought to be outside of the political discourse, which is why, you know, and I think that raises sort of interesting discussions if you think about this year's election, right, when the Black vote was large, and how many claims of fraud were being leveled because of the Black vote. So we're thought to be outside of the political arena. Her decision to refuse this sort of silencing that white supremacy demanded, right? The locals threatened to kill her. She was receiving letters almost 20 years later about what they would do to her if they found her. She left Money, Mississippi before they even read the not guilty verdict. She writes in an interview with Devery Anderson, who writes a book about her. She said in the interview, I knew what the verdict was going to be before the jury came back. She told her team of lawyers, let's go. And they're like, what? You don't want to hear, right, what happened? She's like, I already know what it is. It's going to be not guilty. And, you know, soon after, of course, she quickly found out that it was, that it was not guilty. And so in this way, then Mamie's rhetorical campaign serves as a template of how we think about Black bodies, Black people, and death, in particular, and how we think about the role of Black mothers. So she is this sort of template that I'm looking to sort of theorize and shape how we think about Black mothers in mourning who use their grief. And there's a critique there, but we think oftentimes that these Black mothers must or should use their grief to activate this sort of consciousness to be in the wake. And so then if we move to sort of recent times, to the mothers of the movement who were dubbed the mothers of the movement during the 2016 presidential campaign, it was Sabrina Fulton, Leslie McSpadden, Geneva Reed-Ville, and Lucia Macbeth, and a host of other mothers on that list. But my research has focused particularly on some of the language and the discourse of these four women in particular. Sabrina Fulton, as I have sort of noted, was initially, and she writes several times in interviews, she talks about how she was reluctant to speak out. She was reluctant to speak out because she was so overwhelmed with the death of her youngest son. But she felt called, right? Going back to that sort of gospel or religious language, she felt called by the force of the movement. And she writes that Trayvon is everybody's son, right? And she is everybody's mother. So going back to those sort of tropes of Black mothers as being sort of fungible commodities, as being everybody's mother and nobody's mother, right? And their sons being everybody's son, nobody's son. So she energized sort of these mothers of the movement in ways that helped to sort of galvanize this rhetorical presence that brought these women's bodies, that brought their presence onto a national stage in ways that they would have probably always been denied prior to this. So it's interesting how Black death sort of brings forth or calls forth Black presence onto political stages. Going on, moving to Leslie McSpadden, who is the mother of Michael Brown. So Leslie McSpadden presents an interesting case here to talk about, because unlike the other women who were more in the sort of, or who have been characterized as sort of respectable sort of Black women, right? Leslie McSpadden has always sort of dubbed herself as sort of disrespectable, as being at odds with the sort of political system and the political presence. So she initially, and I don't believe she spoke at the Mothers of the Movement, she initially rejected all of these sort of claims of being representative of the movement. And she says, I don't want my son's death to represent that. She would not have an open casket funeral. She refused that. So in that way, she sort of stands in sort of stark contrast to Mamie Till, right? Mamie Till made a very respectable gesture, right, to not only, right, to show his, right, mutilated body, but to dress him up in one of the best suits, right, to dress Emmett up in a suit to show this sort of respectable child like figure, and not a Black male adult who is this monstrous figure. And so she talked a lot about, you know, how they were trying to tear the system down. They were trying to tear Ferguson up because of what they'd done to her son. And she says in an interview initially following the grand jury's failure to indict Darren Wilson, she says, do you know what it must have felt like? Right? Do you know what those bullets felt like entering my son's body? And how that made him feel? Right? So she's calling on personal feelings. She's calling not only on her own feeling and angst as a mother, but she's speaking for her son in this way, saying, do you know how he felt when he was shot by you all these times, right? Even as he's, right, signaling that he's retreating, and you still shot him. And so she called not only on the police officers' monstrous gestures, but she also talked about the governor. In her conversations with the governor, she talked about how when he was 18 years old, he made these mistakes, and that didn't get him killed, right? Because he was a white man. And so she's challenging this idea that we deserve, or that Black people deserve death because of, even in the face of criminal charges, even if they actually did it, does that naturally inherently lead to death? And thus serving as this sort of interruption, right, of that criminality doesn't mean death, right? Or shouldn't mean death. Geneva Reed Veal, the mother of Sandra Bland, she writes she speaks actually when she's on the stage at the 2016 presidential Democratic National Convention. She says, on that day, I lived the worst nightmare anyone could imagine. I watched as my daughter, Sandra Bland, was lowered into the ground in a coffin. Sandy, my fourth of 5 daughters, was gone. No, not on administrative leave, right? So she's calling it, you know, she's signifying on police getting administrative leaves when they kill someone. No, not on administrative leave, right? But on permanent leave from this earth, found hanging in a jail cell after an unlawful traffic stop and an unlawful, right, arrest. So she's indicting the moral compass of the policing system, and she's calling on the character, the materiality of her daughter's body, and the ways in which, right, this idea that she, right, committed suicide, she's calling that into question. She's interrupting this narrative. And then Lucia McBath, Jordan Davis's mother, she says, and sort of going back to echoing something that Sabrina Fulton said, that I'm still parenting Trayvon. I'm still learning new ways to be a mother, even though he's not physically here with me. Lucia McBath says, you don't stop being a parent when your child dies. She says, I'm still Jordan Davis's mother. His life ended the day he was shot and killed for playing loud music. But my job as his mother didn't. I still wake up thinking about how to parent him, how to protect him and his legacy. And so then I extend this analysis to, right, this concept, if we return, Tate, right, if we can return back to the theoretical framework slide, number 5, if we can return back to that, right, if we think of their discourse and their speeches and their interviews as sort of a confrontation, as its totalistic strategy, saying we have nothing to lose by speaking out, right? Because you never counted us as people anyway. We only can go up from here. We are reborn. We have a new identity. We are mothering in new ways, in unique ways. We don't have anything old to hang on to. Nothing is going to stop us, right? We will be reborn of this fire, this rhetorical fire, I'm arguing, that we shall create. And then finally, if we go to sort of Mamie Till and others, we have the stomach for the fight, right? She says, we're not going to stop. I'm going to be relentless as long as I have breath in my body. And she did. And she goes, and Mamie Till, I don't think I brought this up, but Mamie Till says of J.W. Milam, of the two, she says, you know, I didn't have to get them back. I didn't wish ill will on them. I saw what happened to their lives after, several years after the case, right? They went on to live in misery, right? She says they went on to live in misery. Their guilt, she goes, I believe their guilt ate them up. So echoing that third sort of tenet of confrontational rhetoric, that you are degraded, that you degraded yourself and your humanity because of your guilt. And they ultimately, came back several years later and said they did it, and they felt badly about that. And then finally, if we can move to what I'm calling Black Interruptions. And I borrowed this from Carla Holloway's Passed On Again. So if you can't tell, that's one of my favorite texts. She says, Black culture's stories of death and dying were inextricably linked to the ways in which the nation experienced, perceived, and represented African America. Sometimes it was a subtext, but even then, the ghostly presence of those narratives reminded us that something about America was, for Black folk, disjointed. Instead of death and dying as being unusual, untoward events, or despite being inevitable end-of-life span events, the cycles of our daily lives were so persistently interrupted by specters of death that we worked this experience into the culture's iconography and included it as an aspect of Black cultural sensibility. What if we could just cry and wail and moan like Black mothers? What might it mean to keep going, to persist in the face and in the fact of death, to wail, to stop, to begin again, to interrupt, to tarry with, to worry the lines, to steal away an interruption as an extension of life? Because to grieve is to have life, to have love, and to have been loved. What might refusal sound like? To refuse loss, to remember the dead so that we might bring them with us, to embrace the anti-anesthetic aesthetic, as Kimberly Perez calls it, to carry on with loss on your own terms, a new opening, a new beginning. And might this opening, this hailing, this radical re-envisioning, this disruption function as an opening of sorts, a refusal of what has been refused to you, an opening that probes the depths of Black experience and expression as it exists alongside the quotidian and exceptional circumstances that surround them, an opening that serves as a yes just as much as it is a no, an alternative practice of affirming Black life, a yes to positioning oneself to be made available as a vessel, as a conduit for employing the resources of Black strength, Black resistance, and Black pleasure. A yes to a Black morning that says, I don't have a moment to hate. I will pursue justice for the rest of my life. And might this performance, this interruption, this possibility, enliven and enflesh what Cornel West has called the underside of American democracy, a project that is predicated upon the eradication of Black life. How then do the conditions of Black life, which is to say something about Black death, how do they sketch out a path for rethinking what performance studies scholars calls the intimate public sphere? And so in this talk, in this research, I'm bringing together this concept of interruption as a way to talk about it, not only literally as a cutting off of life, right? But also as a way to talk about an extension of it, as an opening for having new conversations, right? On new grounds with new people in new spaces, right? So that we may talk about the possibilities for enlivening Black life in the face of American democracy. And while this concludes my talk, in future directions in my research, there was things that I could not cover in this talk and in this research presentation that I want to move forward to in future directions. So one of them is to specifically look at Black motherhood as it relates to Black daughters who are prematurely killed by police. As we know, that is oftentimes very overlooked or don't receive the same or sort of attention that Black men do. And then the next project, I want to look specifically at sort of Black fatherhood and Black death. Again, because that's also another topic that we don't hear a lot about. For whatever reason, we don't see a lot of research about these Black fathers who come out and speak about their child's death in the unlikely events of their untimely deaths. And that concludes my presentation. And now, Dean Barry, I'll be open to any questions that you might have. Thank you all for your time.
Thank you. Take a deep breath. Exhale. You did a wonderful job. Thank you for sharing that. I have so many questions, just personal questions as well, just listening to what you shared and your research and your framework of Black motherhood. I was just wondering, just because of the maternal role that Black women play in Black culture, does this Black motherhood also extend to all Black women?
Absolutely, right. So I don't think you have to be a sort of maternal mother or you have to be a physical mother, right? I think in certain ways, Black women have mothered everybody, even when they don't have their, physically have birthed any particular children. They're called to birth, right? I was raised by my grandmother, right? So I think about those aunties and those grandmothers who have had these sort of maternal features or who've had to sort of rear children in certain, maybe in unique ways. So I don't think, in certain ways, I don't think that it excludes certain women. But again, I'm not a Black woman, so I can't speak about exclusion of Black women. I don't know what that particularly feels like, but I know from my vantage point of being a Black son, of a Black mother, and how, she potentially feels and some of the lessons that I've received from her about survival.
Yeah, yeah.
So I
And
hope that
speaking of
answers
that,
the question.
no, yeah, it did, and even speaking of being a Black son, could you kind of talk about what motivated you to choose this as your research topic?
Whew. Yeah, so I'm a deep person, and so I come from a philosophy and a African American literature background. So one thing that particularly motivated me, I did my master's thesis on the role of Black suffering in Toni Morrison and James Baldwin's work. And so a lot of times they kept thinking, and they have two very different approaches, right? Baldwin takes this sort of masculinist approach in talking about suffering, in which he thinks of suffering as this sort of redemptive project, right? So he takes a noticeably religious viewpoint and thinking about suffering as having some redeeming value to it. On the other hand, Morrison takes a noticeably Black feminist approach, and she thinks there's no redemption about suffering, about Black suffering. Her characters, whether you're reading from the bluest eye to a mercy, her characters are completely destroyed by the suffering, by the oppression, by the force, the community around them, by whiteness. And so that got me thinking a lot, not only about Black suffering, right, but the conditions that produce them, right, which oftentimes is white racial violence, which is structural racism, which is poverty, right, which is lack of access to resources and so forth and so on. So, but in particular, in the death, I remember watching on my couch in grad school, watching the verdict from Trayvon Martin come down, not guilty, and Michael Brown, not guilty. And that wore on me, and I knew that there was something that I wanted to think about. So this research actually started, my first conference presentation was in 2015 on Michael Brown and Black mourning. So it goes back quite a while. Yep.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. You've been doing this research for quite a while, and we look forward to reading more and more of what you publish. So thank you.
Thank you so much.
Um, just like Malcolm X, you stand up for Black women. He stated, "The most disrespected person in America is the Black woman. The most unprotected person in America is the Black woman. The most neglected person in America is the Black woman." What are some lessons that Black men can take away from Malcolm's stance on Black women?
Absolutely, that's a brilliant question. think a lot of this, I think, comes down. One is that I think a lot of recent debates in the field and on social media about the relationship between Black women and Black men has oftentimes pitted us against each other in ways that is not true, in ways that are ahistorical, in ways that are not genuine or honest. Because if you look at the long array of African-American history and Black political thought, Black women and Black men oftentimes were in conversation with each other about Black liberation. Does that mean that Black women have always felt included in that project? No, right? That does not mean that, right? We have cases of that. But if we're talking about a robust, right, conversation, I think Black men can learn that we don't have to be in competition, right? Presence, we're not jockeying for presence, or we shouldn't have to jockey for visibility, because we're all suffering from very similar oppressions. And gender dynamics are slightly different, right? But if we think about what binds us, right, I think that's what Malcolm is connecting us to. We have some unique forces that sort of bind us together. So I think that's a critical and pivotal lesson.
Thank you. And in the chat, Tate is saying, thank you for introducing us to new writers and literary sources.
Yeah, I definitely try, because I think one point that I try to differ from a lot of scholars is they'll cite all these names, or they'll say a lot of stuff and won't really kind of talk about where that work comes from. And it just kind of goes in passing, or they'll pass it off. You know, some people pass it off as their own work, and that's plagiarism, and that's disingenuous. And so I always try to, you know, particularly Black thinkers, I'm always trying to give credit and bring people to read new text. So I think that's one way of citing these people and telling you what texts they wrote, so that you might, you know, read the text, or, you know, or be in conversation or relationship with it.
Yeah, thank you. I know we're getting close to the end of our program, but you know, I just wanted to ask you, this is pretty heavy research. This is really serious and really important and critical to our community. And so, in what ways do you find reprieve? What ways are you engaging in self-care?
Yeah, so a lot of people have said this to me. Tate probably is one of the main people who's like, man, you always deal with these heavy topics. How do you find reprieve from it? So I've taken a lot to gardening and plants, and that literally is a way that I escape a lot of things. Because when I'm, you know, my hands is in the dirt and I'm sweating and I'm frustrated with, you know, this not growing, or it needs more water, I've watered it too much, I take a lesson from the plants and learning about stillness and presence, and just being made available to whatever light is coming my way. And so, yeah, I deal a lot with silence and not thinking about ideas all day. So yeah, that's one of the ways I think that I do that.
And that's powerful and important too. It's an important lesson to just be still and focus on that life. That's good. Thanks for sharing that, especially, you know, when you are discussing the heaviness of death and that cycle.
Yeah.
So
Absolutely.
are there any additional questions from folks that have joined the call in our audience?
And if there's none, I could still say also there's a lot there, from what I've seen, there's a lot of new scholarship out on Black mothers and Black maternal politics that is coming out from graduate students in particular. And Henry Washington Jr. was one of those people whose article, Henry's at Stanford, whose recent article on Black mothers came out in Women in Performance Journal. So if you're on the lookout for younger scholars, I think Henry Washington Jr. is one of those people. So I'm excited about the research that's coming out. And I see Jay has a hand up.
You could have finished your sentence. Yeah, I just had a moment of clarity of how you talked about Emmett Till, which I think was in a new way, and I thought that I appreciated that a lot in regards to not even just focusing on Emmett Till's intentions, but also just it allowed me a chance to notice that Emmett Till's body served as not only as a place of reckoning and a place of also of revolution, it also served as a warning. And so naming that Emmett Till as a performance of warning that white folks used as a carryover, and how Leslie McSpadden said that that wording wasn't necessary, and that she didn't want her child to be used in that same way, was like a very critical and pointed point of reflection for me. So I want to just thank you for that. And that was a good noticing, because I think that's talking about Emmett Till in like a new way that, you know, is not often talked about. And then my question is, you referenced it, but I'm curious around all the discussion that's going on now around, you know, liberatory politics and clout chasing and revolution, and connecting to Black pain and Black suffering while doing activism. What is a good way of telling and sharing Black stories and pushing for the eradication of Black death, while also not speaking over the Black women that are in the movement or mothers of the movement?
Yeah, Jay, I think that's one that's complicated, but also, and I will answer your question. So I think in certain ways, this is, as you know, you study. This is connected, I think, to the larger sort of trajectory of Black political thought, right? So this is not new in that way, right? We see this happening in the Black Power movement. We see this sort of happening in the Black civil rights movements, or any sort of Black larger movements for liberation has oftentimes been a tension at a lot of times between sort of activists or people who are on the ground and the people that it directly sort of impacts. So I think a lot of times those do clash. I mean, who gets to speak for whom and at what time and under what circumstances and conditions. So I think that's one question, or one sort of response. The second part, and I think your question was like, what lessons are there to be learned, right? Is that, yeah, we don't, I mean, and oftentimes I think of, I'm not a big social media person, but also times I think that a lot of times in our efforts to inform people, we inherently take this sort of leadership model approach of sort of Black resistance, to where like, I'm the authority on Black death, or I'm the authority on Black women, or I'm the authority on Black trans women's experiences, right? And I think that one model, sort of that leadership model of Black politics, is nasty. And I think it's not, I think a lot of times it's not genuine. And I think a lot of times it is about attention, or about getting a certain visibility that does come with being the first one to say this, all right? And I think a lot of times we think we're the first person to say something, and we're not. Just because we're the first person to get attention from it, right? I think that makes it a unique circumstance or tension there, because I never think I'm saying something that nobody else has said. I just have a platform to be heard, right? I'm only following in the tradition of Black thinkers who come before me. So I'm sure somebody said it before. You know what I mean? Our grandmother's been saying stuff like this. We just have a platform that they didn't. And so I think that complicates it when you have a large platform. And I don't ever want to be one of those people with those, because I think it becomes messy. I'll save my thoughts, but I do think it becomes very messy when you kind of put yourself at the face of a movement, or as a representative for.
Would you like to weigh in also on some of the experiences, or recently, I think it was this past week, Tamir Rice's mother was sharing that she was asking for folks to stop capitalizing off of the death of her son, and how she had been continuing to suffer. Could you weigh in on that, on that experience of Black motherhood and the folks that are clout chasing in that way?
Yeah, because I think also, and this goes back to Jade and Dr. Berry, I think this goes back to sort of Leslie McSpain, right, who talks about, like, she was very furious at seeing her son's image on shirts, right, immediately sort of following after the verdict. You saw these Mike Brown shirts, or these hands up, don't shoot, and she was very furious, like, with that. And so I think this is almost not that different, right? So I told you, I think it's in a tradition. I don't think it's that different. And unfortunately, I think it's complicated. But yes, I don't think we should be profiting off of death or off of other Black people's oppressions. I just don't think we should. And I don't think we should seek to be the face of a movement. Sure, be vocal about it, but also wedge your vocalism to being on the streets, on everyday life, into grassroots resistance, right? And so I think I have a disconnect, because a lot of times the people that are the most loud folk on social media talking are not doing everyday grassroots political work. So they want a platform, but not the sort of landscape that comes with that platform of doing the hard work, that we see so much that's happening on the ground. So if you're connected to the ground, then I think maybe you deserve a certain say so, but not at the expense of people that it directly impacts. I just don't ever think you should take that route. So that's my roundabout way answer in trying to answer or put forth my response. Yeah.
Thanks for that, Jake. And Shannon in the chat is saying, I'm trying to take a break from more academic articles with more fiction novels or some nonfiction. Any recommendations in regards to your work? Thank you.
Yes, I love Jesmyn Ward. Jesmyn Ward has several books that have won, 2 of her books won American Book Awards, which is unheard of to win an American Book Award, but to have 2 books, I think in back-to-back almost win. So one is called Men We Reaped. And Tate, what's the other one? Is it Salvage the Bones? Yeah, and Salvage the Bones. So Jesmyn Ward, I think, is a great.
And could you spell that in the chat for us, Tate? The author's name.
Oh, and I see Imani Perry, reference to Imani Perry. Yeah, Jesmyn Ward and Imani Perry. And I would say Eddie Glaude, but I'm trying to elevate Black women in here. So we'll say Jesmyn and Imani Perry.
Sing Unburied, Sing Sing. Dominic says, how do you connect to the ground if you don't know where to start or contribute?
Well, fortunately, I think, right, we're seeing a lot of ground movements around voter registration and voter participation in this deep South. I don't know, Dominic, where you're particularly located, but I think that's a good ground to sort of fight on, considering that immediately after this election, more than 20, 30 states are immediately trying to change voting laws to restrict who can vote. So I think, if you have an issue that you're passionate about, look up coalitions, and usually you can follow people on social media that typically point you there. But yeah, I think in most local spaces, there's local politics, and I'm a big fan. And I think some of my research is going to probably go back towards looking at grassroots stuff, because I initially started looking at like Black Power stuff, but I was looking at the Lowndes County Freedom Democratic Party, which became the Black Panther Party. And I was interested in grassroots politics and grassroots movement. So I think that's a great place to think about. But I'm particularly passionate about voting rights right now in the South, because I think that's what's directly impacting a lot of us.
Well, I'm super excited to see what happens to your future and the work that you're going to produce and the books and the articles. And once this dissertation is properly defended, you are going to really soar, because this is part of the academic that I really don't pay attention to. Like, I never even thought about adding Black mourning into probably because we live it so much, right?
Right.
Right. Not even just Black folks, but thinking about our Asian brothers and sisters, right? Like, now so many people are now thinking about, we now need to start talking about, why is Asian history also being excluded out of history books, or why is there such a so many potholes when it comes to inclusion, when it comes to our Asian community. So, but there's many connections that Blacks and Asian folks have in commonalities, right? When it comes to suffering by the hands of white terrorists in America. Like, if we just
and we don't typically put those right in conversation. We typically think they're at odds.
Exactly.
Because there's a history of that, right? So we have to be true to that too.
Yes.
Because I think, sorry, Brooke, go ahead, because I think you're on.
Oh no, I was saying yes. Yeah, we have to acknowledge that history. Absolutely.
Because I think we whitewash so many things in order to be politically correct, and I'm not a politically correct person, but I think there's a lot of tension there of anti-Blackness in Asian communities, right? We talked with the death of Latasha Harlan, right? We saw this, right? So, and it happens in Black communities where we see a strong Asian presence, oftentimes that have access to stores and resources and and Black people are, you know, patronaging these stores, and so they
Right.
Black folks have reported negative encounters with Asian communities. So we have to acknowledge that.
Absolutely. Yeah, and it just shows how pervasive whiteness is, right?
Yes.
Literally brainwashed most of us in our education system and the way that we operate and navigate even different relationships with other minority groups, right? And so, but I can go on and on, but I appreciate you so much. And is there any social media handles that we can follow you on? Twitter's, Instagram, anything?
I'm not a social media girl. As y'all know, I'm on social media at Twitter at g.martell, and then Facebook, I can put that in the chat, and then Facebook is Goyland Williams, but occasionally Facebook is where I would say some academic stuff. So I would encourage more Facebook than Twitter, because I try to stay away from the Twitter debates.
Awesome. Well, we are super excited to any updates or any things coming up for you that we can be on the lookout for.
Yeah, so as Dr. Berry kind of mentioned, this book chapter that I'm really excited about on Club Quarantine, where I look at the rhetorical construction of Black womanhood in Jill Scott versus Erykah Badu and Patti LaBelle versus Gladys Knight. And that is with my
I can't wait for that.
Yeah, and that's with my friend, he was on here earlier, my friend and UMass fellow, UMass grad student, Matali Banda, who's in the Afro-Am department at UMass. So that should be coming this summer, actually. So that's the work I'm really proud of.
That is awesome. So dope. That is so dope.
Because I was Patty and Tate was Gladys.
Right.
Wow.
And I'm Gladys. Right.
I'm actually neither. I'm
Patty. But on that verses, you were Gladys.
And yeah, I'll add Auntie Dion into the mix.
Right. Well, it is with great pleasure to really invite you again, if we can in the future, to back to Marymount in person. And I thank God for having.
I got my vaccine, so I'm ready.
That's good. I appreciate our friendship, and I appreciate you pushing me as well in the when it comes to the academic side of myself, and really thinking broader in terms of who is suffering and who is silenced. So thank you again. Thank you all just so real much, quick, everybody. And we hope that you all stay safe and enjoy the rest of Women's History Month.
Thank you all. The invitation was great. I loved it.
Bye-bye. Thank you.